Welcome to the
All right.
306th meeting of the New York Comics and Picture Stories Symposium. This is a weekly lecture series about comics, illustration, animation, and the history of text image work. We're sponsored in part by the Will and Ann Eisner Family Foundation. And our guest tonight is Anders Nilsen. He's an artist and an author of 10 books, including Big Questions, The End, and Don't Go Where I Can't Follow. His work has been featured in the New York Times, The Believer, Mome, Kramer's Ergot, and elsewhere. His books have been translated into several languages, and his paintings and drawings have been exhibited internationally. He received 3 Ignatz Awards as well as the Lynd Ward Prize for the best graphic novel. And Big Questions was listed as a New York Times notable book. He's been both a participant and organizer of the Pierre Feuille Ciseaux, an experimental collaborative comics residency in France. He's speaking to us from Los Angeles, and his talk tonight is entitled The Genealogy of a Story. So take it away, Anders.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks everybody for coming out or not coming out, turning your computers on. So let's see. Yeah, Genealogy of a Story. That seemed like a good title at the time. I'm basically going to talk about my current project, Tongues. I think when I agreed to do this talk, I thought the most recent issue of the book would be long out, but as it turns out, I am going to the bindery to pick up copies tomorrow. So this talk is apropos of the release of the latest chapter of Tongues. So I'll start with kind of just what you're looking at here. This is on the left side is the first issue, the cover of the first issue of the story. And on the right side is a very complicated, sort of messy family tree that tries to kind of chart how all my work over the last 20 years has sort of led me to the place that I am now, and this book that I'm working on, Tongues. So I don't expect anybody to really, maybe you can't even really read the words on the chart, but roughly speaking, what you're looking at is the stuff in yellow are books and sort of works of mine, and how they're like where their sources came from, like what contributed to their coming into existence. That's the little black dots. The blue highlight is people completely or circumstances completely outside me that led to the existence of my work, to the existence of each of these different pieces, books, stories, etc. And then there's 5 pieces that are circled in red, and those are pieces that I'm going to talk about that sort of led directly to Tongues, the current project. In a way, the book is kind of, I sort of see it as the culmination of the last 20 years of work. It sort of feels like all these other things have kind of led to it. And so that makes it sort of interesting to me, at least, to to sort of take this moment in my life and career as an artist or whatever to kind of think about like where do ideas come from? Where do, you know, how do the circumstances sort of your life lead you to these particular moments that stand out? So let's see, we'll come back to this chart again. You can do a screen grab so you can study it for the test. Let's see. It doesn't want to advance. Okay. So where do your ideas come from? Like as you, I don't know, whatever, as I like worked more and more and came out with books and would go on book tours or do release events or whatever, you start to see patterns in the kinds of questions you get from readers. And this is probably one of the big questions that comes, so to speak, that comes up regularly and frequently in different forms. Where do your ideas, or where do ideas come from? It feels very mysterious, I think, to everybody. It feels mysterious to me. I've been doing it for, 20 or however many decades. And yeah, it's very hard to trace them, even if it's what you do every day, day in and day out. I think really there's kind of no good answer. So when people ask this, whatever version of this story, the other one is, how do you deal with writer's block? Basically the same question. There's not really a good answer. So what you end up sort of doing is just trying to distract the questioner in a interesting enough way that they won't feel cheated. But it kind of comes to like a question of like consciousness and like how our brains work. And so that makes it difficult, even like within psychology or the field of sort of like neurology. The question of consciousness is literally called the hard problem because it's so difficult to figure out. So like our brains are not really constructed to figure out like the basics of physics. We can't really fully understand like how electrons work. It's too weird. We can kind of try to understand it through mathematics or whatever, but we can't actually picture it in our brains. Our brains are just made for other stuff. And the mind is sort of the same way. Like we can't get in there and see what's happening. We can't get behind the curtain because our consciousness is in front of the curtain. So anyway, I get this question now and then, and it's something I'm interested in anyway, but the question sort of points me back to the idea and makes it sort of interesting. It's like, it is this unsolvable mystery, and what's more interesting to contemplate than an unsolvable mystery? One way I kind of think about it is, if you're a zookeeper and your job is to keep animals happy and alive, the point is not really to, you're not trying to create something. You have to make an environment that they're going to thrive in. So what kind of environment do ideas need in order to thrive or to exist? We're jumping ahead a little bit. So some of the basic answers, it only goes forward. Some of the basic answers that I've kind of come up with is, it's easier if you get started when you are young. It gets easier with a lot of practice. The 10,000 hour rule, I think, applies. It's easy to think of something like this as not really being about practice or not really being a skill. It feels like it's so mysterious. It's just things that drop out of the sky, that drop out of heaven or wherever ideas and inspiration come from, the muses. But it really is something that you can sit down and get better at, put time in. Failing that, it helps if you can trick other people into coming up with your ideas for you. That's a super important one to me. That's all those blue highlighted bits. Going out and interacting in the world, it sort of magically happens that people will give you ideas or force you to come up with ideas. Ugh. Ben, I'm gonna have to go back. There's something wrong with the way my things are going back and forth with the PDF. I don't know. Okay, well, this will have to work. So yeah, it's a sort of a delicate business. Hunting for them really means making yourself available for them to find you. There's a quote that came to mind when I was thinking about this. My grandfather used to tell a story about courting my grandmother. And he would say that he chased her until she caught him. And I feel like that makes sense to me for the way that he is the world. And a lot of time you're not going to get any there ready. I feel I've been quite lucky. Probably there's a huge amount of luck also involved. But if you employ the above ideas, you might have more ideas than you can practically handle. In which case, for efficiency, it may be useful to try to cram as many of them as you can into a single. And so this is that book. So this is the cover of the latest issue of Tongues. Like I said, it kind of is a repository for all the ideas that I've been sort of developing over the course of I guess the last 20 years, really. We'll kind of skip past this. Yeah, I've got some lag in my internet. So for the purposes of the kind of the rest of the discussion, I guess, basically, I'm going to talk about 5 different pieces and sort of their histories, and then how they've kind of fed into Tongues and my current project. So these are the 5 basically. On the left, going from the top left clockwise, Sisyphus, which is a story I did for Kramer's Ergot back in like 2004. Dogs and Water is my first published book. It's not really the first comics that I ever made, but it's the first published book. The silhouette image is from Rage of Poseidon, and it's an image of Prometheus and the eagle from the Greek mythology or the Greek drama, Prometheus Bound. Below that is a painting I did probably in 2007 or something that stuck in a friend's mind. And then the last image here is from an accordion book that I did for a show that was, I was invited to be in a show by a friend and to keep a sketchbook. And this is sort of what resulted. So Sisyphus. So I guess in 98, 99, 2000, I had started, I'd been a very different kind of artist before that, and had sort of found my way back to doing comics in those years. This is after graduating from art school, being out for a little while, and trying to figure out what kind of art was actually meaningful to me outside of the context of school. Which I think is a common struggle that art students encounter. So I did a few zines and a few mini comics that little by little found their way out into the world and connected with people. And I found out that way that there were other people doing this thing, making little weird photocopied comics. And one of the people that came across my work was Sammy Harcum, who was editing at the time kind of a small, humble anthology called Kramer's Ergot, but he had plans for a slightly more ambitious version and asked me if I would do something for it. I was at the time working on my main project, which was Big Questions, a book about little birds, and was sort of, I had just dropped out of graduate school and was kind of spending a lot of time listening to lectures on tape about philosophy. I was sort of a philosophical dabbler, and was struck by the doctrine of the eternal return, which is a Nietzschean idea, being that you should live your life in such a way that if you came back and had to live it all over again exactly as it went the first time, that would be a welcome prospect. Which is, like, of course, kind of an absurd idea in itself, but to me, it was very thought-provoking. And so I decided to do this piece about sort of taking that idea to a kind of absurd, ultimate limit, and use Sisyphus as the example where he's already doing this thing over and over again. And the idea basically is, what if he actually enjoys it? It's meant as a punishment, of course, but what if he actually enjoys it? Working on this story, it kind of came in two parts. One is more about Sisyphus, and then the other one, I expanded it out to start to play with other Greek mythology, other stories from that canon or whatever. And I kind of ended up retelling the story of the Minotaur, which is, he's sort of he's the villain, I guess, in maybe it's the story of Theseus, but telling the story from his point of view and sort of recasting it in present day terms, which is something, I guess I ended up doing that a little bit in vague ways in Big Questions, but this is the first time that I sort of took Greek mythology and started playing with it. I was a huge fan as a kid, I guess, of Greek mythology. I don't know if people are familiar with the D'Aulaire's book of Greek mythology, but that was a huge influence on me, and I love those stories. So it was fun to kind of play in that sandbox. So that was, Sammy asked me to do a story, and I just kind of like grabbed at the thing that was at hand, which is these like philosophical lectures I was listening to, and then Greek mythology, which was sort of deep in my narrative source in my brain. But that's very much a story that would not have existed if somebody didn't sort of give me the opportunity and ask me to come up with something. What happened then is the story is like 20 pages, 19 pages or something. And as often happens with me, if I spend a little time working on a story, it starts to balloon out into a larger thing. I can't really do a 4-page story. It always wants to be a graphic novel. So I set this aside. I was already working on a graphic novel on big questions, and just let it be. But it was like very much a subject and a story that for me felt like it wanted to get returned to. So for years, I sort of assumed once I was done with these other projects, I would come back to this. And I had ideas about what if Sisyphus loses his rock, somebody like smashes the rock, then what does he do? And I started to have ideas about the goose, which you see in the right side, and the identity of the goose, and malicious subplots on the part of the goose. So those things kind of just percolated for years while I worked on other projects. So this is a slightly pixelated image of Dogs in Water, the cover of Dogs in Water, which was my first proper book. It was another thing that I took a break from working on big questions, working on other projects to do. It was another thing that had roots in my sketchbooks, which is a huge germination field for my work. This came from sketchbooks I was working in after undergrad that really were actually about the idea of kind of being an artist and the sort of absurdity of being an artist, I guess, in the world. What happened again was I'd been sort of plugging away on big questions. I think I'd sent a few issues out to publishers to see if they were anybody might be interested. Didn't hear too much back, but a few years went by, and Chris Oliveros at Drawn and Quarterly wrote me an email commissioning a story. I'll always remember that email because it was on Valentine's Day. I was working as a cook doing a special fixed price meal for Valentine's Day. And between seatings, I went down to the basement to the office to look at my email and take a break. And I saw this email from a publisher, which was, hugely great news to me. So again, an impetus coming from outside of my own brain. And so in figuring out what kind of story I might want to do, I went back to my sketchbooks and I found these little strips about a guy walking around in the middle of nowhere with a teddy bear on his back, trying to understand why he was out there. And in the original strips, the sort of metaphor was pretty simple, which was this idea of sort of, as an artist growing up, I sort of had this idea that I would be an artist, not really knowing what that entailed or what that meant. And after finishing school, it sort of felt a bit like being banished to the wilderness. And so the teddy bear sort of embodies this like slightly childish notion that one might make a life in such a manner. In the book, there's this passage at one point. He gets frustrated with the bear, throws it on the ground, starts jumping up and down on it. And as he's expressing his frustration, a bus comes by, somebody opens a window and pretends to shoot him. out of the window of the bus. It was a little bit of a throwaway scene. It didn't amount to very much in the story. It sort of just serves as a way for him to like check his frustration. But time went by, the book came out. It had its own kind of weird story as a book, but it eventually came out. And it was a book, I think more than anything I've done, I've had more random emails from people wanting to make a film out of it. None of which have ever gone anywhere, as is often the case. But it seemed to kind of like connect with a certain kind of person. Anyway, one of the few inquiries that went anywhere past a random email was from a Canadian director who was thinking about doing something with it and wanted to know if I would write a script. It's a fairly thin book. I think it's like 80 or 90 pages. Not a lot happens. It's very slow. So he suggested that there might be room to add some action, some scenes somewhere. And one of the places that he suggested was, what if when these vehicles are coming by, what if a vehicle stopped and this character had an interaction? And I thought that was sort of an interesting idea. And so I wrote the script, sent it to him, and like I said, as often happens, nothing happened. So I put the script on the shelf or in a drawer and basically forgot about it, or tried to forget about it. But I'd written this scene, and it just kind of kept kind of pulling at my sleeve. It was a scene that I sort of really liked, where this one truck ends up stopping. He has a slightly ominous interaction, and it sort of changes the course of things. So that was one more kind of like unfinished story that I put in the back of my head. These color images are from tongue. So what ended up happening is I ended up doing the scene basically to go together with tongues. But I'll talk a little bit about that later. But there's something, I guess, for myself as an artist, there's something deeply unsatisfying about having a story fragment that feels like it works, that has no place in the world. That's something that's sort of led to various projects of mine, is just like, there's a little fragment of something, it feels like it needs to get finished, it won't leave you alone. And so at some point when you finish a big project, it's like one of the things that is sitting there waiting to get finished, to get fleshed out. So back to sketchbooks. This is a spread from a sketchbook, I would guess maybe 2007 or 08. And I was doing a lot of work like this in sketchbooks, sort of unrelated to anything in particular, sort of these little monologues from a generic silhouetted figure, kind of a blank figure speaking directly to the reader. Some were short, some were a little bit longer, some were sort of more coherent, some were story-ish ideas, some were more poetic or random or absurd. And a few touched on this connection that I have to Greek mythology. So this is one that existed that is a sort of retelling and updating of the Prometheus myth. at some point around that time, I think around 2009, 2010, a friend of mine who was a novelist had a book coming out. I had done a couple of small illustrations for this short story collection. He had the book finally coming out and asked me and a couple of the other illustrators if we would want to do something for a book reading, for a book release. And I kind of looked at what, the various scraps, the little tidbits that I had around to see what might work for a reading. I've always felt like, at least for me, reading comics, doing slide readings of comics is awkward. For one thing, a lot of my comics have a lot of silent bits, which don't work that well in a slideshow format. And then you've got this kind of odd back and forth where you've got word balloons, and the audience is probably reading the word balloons along with you or reading ahead, or who knows what's going on. So I thought I would try a little experiment and just draw a couple of big sort of single images that I could then read short stories to. So just project one big image and just read a story, and maybe that would work a little better. Or at least would be an attempt at something different. So I poked around in my sketchbooks and found a number of pieces that touched on Greek mythology or stories from the Bible. There was one about Isaac and Abraham, one about Poseidon. I think maybe those were the first three. And I think I made a few images for the Poseidon one, and one each for this one and for Isaac and Abraham. And it worked pretty well. I didn't have a lot of time, so I did this kind of like silhouette thing. I thought that would be a simple way to make a compelling image without spending a lot of labor on cross-hatching or stippling or whatever, the kinds of things I usually do. And I gave the talk, and then kind of forgot about it for a little bit. A year or two later, Big Questions came out, and I went on a long book tour for that. And I kind of got sick again of reading the comics of Big Questions. And so at a certain point, I started shortening the Big Questions reading and adding in this mythology reading. And more people would ask, like, what was I planning to do with it? Would I think about doing a book? So little by little, I sort of expanded on them. I decided it did probably make sense to do a book, and that became Rage of Poseidon, which came out in like 2013. But this image in particular, even after the book came out, kind of stuck with me. For people that know the story of, or don't know the story of Prometheus, the simple version is he brings fire to humans against the will of the gods. And as a punishment, he's chained to the side of a mountain, and an eagle comes every day and eats his liver. And the liver grows back, and then he has to go through the same thing every day. But in kind of exploring that situation, I became interested in the eagle and what this like endless daily interaction would be like, and what kind of relationship would develop. And as the world is changing, if this goes on literally for an eternity, so it's still going on now, what's the fallout? How does that work? Like, what are the details? So that becomes another kind of just little, slightly unformed, unfinished idea that kind of goes on the shelf with everything else. This is an early version of that book. It also became a accordion and the cover. So moving back several years to the early 2000s, once again, somebody outside my brain, somebody asked me to do an image for a book of mythological monsters. I did this, I think it's called the Sianach. I don't know, it's some kind of mythological deer that devours cows and people, cattle and cattle herders. And I was sort of interested in, not so much in the actual creature, but in the scene. I had a little art show a few years later in 2008 and did this image, which I actually rather dislike, but it stuck in certain people's heads. A good friend of mine who's a photographer ended up doing a really beautiful, quite different version, but something a little bit connected to this idea that I love. But it also appears to have stuck with my friend Sammy, who, like I said, commissioned, did the anthology Kramer's Ergot and sort of got me started on the Sisyphus story. He was, I don't know what issue it was, Kramer's 8 maybe. He was sort of sending out a call for material, asking cartoonists to do stuff for the issue, and had asked me to do something, and I was probably busy and probably wasn't staying on top of my email, but at some point I talked to him and said I would love to do something, but I don't really know what I would do. And he suggested taking this character, having them get up and sort of like walk through some kind of landscape and like use that as a sort of starting point for a story. Long story short, I never did anything with it, but that image stuck in my head, and sort of went again on the shelf with these other sort of half-finished, unrelated ideas. So that's 4. Coming to the 5th one. This is a little later. This is maybe 2012. I just moved to Minnesota, back to Minneapolis, where I grew up, from Chicago. After years of what I guess you could call personal upheaval, changes, and a couple of friends, I think if the order of events is right in my head, a couple of friends were passing through Minneapolis on a sort of art tour. I was out of town, but they stayed at my place. And afterward, one of them, Monica Choi, asked, I guess she was putting on a show in Portland, Oregon. And the premise of the show is that she was sending these small accordion sketchbooks to a bunch of different artists, asking them to keep it as a sketchbook for a month and then send back the result for the show. So I kind of just started doodling in it, playing with some ideas, kind of just sticking some weird objects and creatures in a landscape. I'm not really sure where the cubes came from exactly. There are some slightly similar things that happen in a couple other places in my work. But little by little, I just sort of started extending this landscape and thought about how it might work to try to tell a little story in a single unfolding panel. So I have this character kind of fly in or fall down into the landscape, and then some various things kind of happen. It's very simple. It's like a very quick kind of chase scene and a little fight, and then it's kind of over, a little interaction between two characters, and then it's over. But it's really kind of about the landscape and the just having a chance to kind of play and invent weird occupants of this place. And I thought for years about trying to figure out a way to turn this into an edition thing, which I did eventually. I made a small edition of these accordion books. But the cubes definitely stuck with me. And then this character with the weird mushrooms or whatever is growing out of his back also kind of like stuck with me as a character that might potentially be worth playing with again in the future. So that brings us to about 2012, 2013. At this point, I finished, so Big Questions ended up taking me many years, finally came out in 2011. At that point, I was able to kind of go back to some of these projects. I did these sort of half-finished projects. So the Rage of Poseidon actually came out after that in 2013. I did a reissue of another book. So I could kind of spend a few years just like finishing up half-finished projects. And then finally came to a point where I could work on something new and figure out like where did I want to go with my work and my life from that point. And I kind of just decided, whereas everything, all the books that I've done, almost literally every book that I'd done up until that point had kind of grown out of sketchbooks. And, you know, the random commissions or suggestions from friends or whatever, but it's like a lot of the imagery, a lot of the themes were sort of developed in very rudimentary kind of crude ways in my sketchbook. And then little by little, they grew into something else. Tongues is a little different in that it grew out of these other works. So I ended up borrowing that scene from Dogs and Water and that character. So that character then becomes a part of the story. The guy walking around in the middle of nowhere with the bear on his back. The guy in the accordion book with the mushrooms on his back sort of ends up getting borrowed as the character design for Prometheus. The book is sort of centered around Prometheus in a way. In my head is kind of centered around Prometheus' relationship with the eagle. Those boxes in the landscape become important and end up having connection to other Greek mythology. The Sisyphus story that I originally had sort of thought would get developed into a larger story ended up kind of falling by the wayside, but some elements from it, including the goose that had hidden motives or hidden ideas, ended up sort of translating into some kind of connection with the story of Leda and the Swan, so Zeus and the seduction of Zeus taking the form of a swan to seduce a mortal woman. So the swan sort of becomes the Zeus character in Tongues. And then Sammy's idea about the dead or injured person with the guts hanging out, walking through a landscape. may or may not really exactly happen in the book, but it really became sort of an idea of something that will be, I don't know, I don't want to, no spoilers, I guess, but it's something that's in store, possibly in a different form. So yeah, so that's kind of the genealogy of that book. It's a thing, it's sort of interesting. I just put the, maybe I'll go back to, if the technology will allow, I'll come back to my little chart. It was sort of interesting putting this together. A couple of years ago, I did another book called Poetry is Useless. That was sort of a collection of strips from my sketchbooks. And my favorite part of that book ended up being an index that I made of subjects that the book addressed, that some of the comics addressed. And this is sort of an initial stab at it's a slightly different idea, but it's this idea of trying to kind of like quantify almost the themes and the ideas that run through a life or a career. So it's almost sort of the beginnings of like an index for my whole practice as an artist. Maybe someday I'll go back to this and create a bibliography. So I think that brings us to, yeah, what is it? It's 7:50. I am happy to entertain questions or any comments that people might have.
Sure. You can put your name in the chat or unmute yourself and ask, just to keep an order to the questions. Drop your name in the chat if you have a question for Anders.
My general policy is I have to have at least 3 questions, or I'm not allowed to leave.
I have a question about so you were working as a professional chef? And does that have any impact on your
I was a cook.
Yeah.
That is a good question. It had the impact maybe that I really didn't want to be a cook anymore, and so it made me work really hard as a cartoonist so I could escape.
So the art of cooking wasn't competing with comics? Or,
no, I never, it really was a job. I never entertained ideas of like starting a restaurant or anything like that. When I was thinking about this idea of ideas and sort of the 10,000 hour hypothesis, that you have to put in 10,000 hours to really become truly great or truly good at anything. I did think about the fact that, so I was a cook at that level, at sort of like at a nice restaurant, a real restaurant, for about 5 years. And a lot of what I did was cook brunch. So, and I was sort of the egg person for a good part of that. And I remember finishing, like quitting and being done. And then years, even like 3, 4, 5 years later, realizing that even after 5 years cooking, I still was figuring out, like I was still getting the fine points of how to poach an egg. So like I'd put in, thousands of hours probably poaching eggs. And like the fine points of that skill were still like getting like sorted out in my brain.
Yeah.
So poached eggs are just like comics, I guess.
Oh, I mean, they both interest me, but no, I mean, anybody who can do that professionally, I don't take that, but I mean, it sort of immediately elevates it to a high skill. Whether it's an art,
I mean,
I don't know. You got it.
Yeah, I would say it definitely is. Like, I don't know that I ever got it to that point. But I remember the point, it's like when I started out as a cook, feeling like I was barely keeping my head above water, you know, if it got busy and you had, you know, 15 different orders that you were trying to juggle. And then the moment after a year or two where I realized, like, oh, I can do this. I can keep all 7 balls in the air at once and not break anything and not drop anything. That was a cool moment. And I feel like, in some ways, I feel like it's taken me 19 or 20 years in comics to feel that way. But
okay. There's a question from Martha Coleman. You want to try to unmute yourself?
Oh, sorry. I just wondered on a technical scale, how are you making these drawings? They're so detailed. And so I was just wondering, are you using colored pens or pencils? I also had a question about Ovid's Metamorphosis, but you could come back to that if you want. But I love the way your characters and your drawings morph from one shape into another, like that character that had the mushrooms kind of billowing out of its back. So there's a technical question and then more of a, I don't know, mythological question.
Okay. Let's see. So technical, like the materials that I use are kind of like consumer, like technical pens. So like people use microns. A lot of cartoonists use microns. I like these Stettler pens. That's what I mostly draw with. The color work, a lot of it's digital. So like that's digital. I guess a lot of the other color, like a lot of the color covers, like that Dogs in Water cover or the Guts painting, are gouache. I really like the feel, the kind of super matte, sort of chalky feel of gouache. I think a lot of the cubes in that other lower left-hand page or image are gouache also. I don't know if that answers that question. As far as, I've never read Ovid's Metamorphosis. Is there a what's exactly the question? Maybe I forgot the question.
I was just thinking that because you're inspired by Greek mythology, I was wondering if that was something in your mind, or maybe if you get stuck, you can take a look at it. But it's a lot of stories of, you know, love and violence and different characters morphing into each other. So it was just something that your work made me think about.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you know, all that stuff is like, what is it, like 2,000 years old or more, but it feels super vital to me. Like I don't think I'd read Prometheus Bound, the Aeschylus play, until after I did that first Prometheus story. And it was fascinating to me to go back and actually read, you know, I mean, Aeschylus's play isn't the first discussion of Prometheus in like written form. So there's various sources, but it was fascinating to me to find how like textured and complex and human those stories were. I mean, it shouldn't have really been a surprise. There's a reason why they've lasted 2,000 years. That's actually, so that's one of the things, is like trying to figure out like what's my next project going to be. Part of that was like fleshing out each of these sort of fragmentary ideas that I had on the shelf. And so part of that process was going back to read things like the original source material for Prometheus. And one of the things, if you delve into Aeschylus and Prometheus, is that Prometheus Bound, the play that we know, where most of the Prometheus myth comes from, is actually one of 3 plays, and the other 2 are lost. So we don't actually know what the rest of the story is. Or apparently even if Prometheus Bound is the beginning of the story or the end of the story. I think it's mostly thought to be the beginning of the story. But that made it super interesting to me then to take that story and like, you know, there are these fragmentary ideas of what maybe happens afterwards, but nobody really knows. So like, that's a great place to go as a storyteller, is like, take this ancient story that is not finished yet, or like not the ending is not known. So I think that was one of the things that kind of made me like really excited to play with that subject.
Yeah, there's a question from Karen. Karen, did you want to ask that?
Oh, I was just going to leave it in the chat, but sure.
Oh,
Hi, Andre.
okay.
I was wondering about what differs in the way you want to tell a story, or the way a story, I guess, literally unfolds, between doing an accordion book and doing a more traditional codex book.
Sure, that's a good question. That's something I have played with several times, the accordion, and want to continue to play with. I feel like that's something that is not leading into tongues, but it's something that like once tongues is done, I want to go back to. So the first accordion book I did was Rage of Poseidon, which is just like single images per page. So it's really not using the accordion book form in a especially interesting way. But then the second thing was that, well, I don't know if I can get all the way to it, was this box landscape image. Let's see if we can get there. And I thought, yeah, like it felt really interesting and really new. Like I'm sure it's been done out there somewhere, but the idea of having this super long, it just allows you to have this super long scene, and then to have something moving through that landscape to try to tell a story in a single scene. I mean, obviously I'm placing the same character doing different actions or whatever. So it's sort of like, in a way it's a single scene, in a way it's not. But that has felt really interesting. Like I've gone back to it with I did this coloring book a couple years ago, and I took some scenes or some images from that, and sort of, or parts of that book were actually like a long landscape. I also, a couple years ago, or I guess 2 years ago now, had an opportunity to do a small show in Berlin, and I had a small room to deal with in this building. And so I did it. It's like, it wasn't an accordion book, but it was the walls of a room. So like a comic that sort of unfolds over a continuous landscape in a room. That's something I would definitely like to go back to. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm interested in sort of ways of bookmaking, or ways of sort of visual storytelling that are different. Like I've ended up kind of making comics and then sort of thought of as a cartoonist, but like there's definitely, bookmaking is definitely as much a part of my practice, I feel like, as like comics is. And like, yeah, the visual storytelling thing. So that's something I'll definitely play with and explore more.
Cool, thanks.
Question from Danielle. Is that pronounced right?
Hello, Anders. Thanks so much. Thanks, Ben. I've just had a quick question. When you're gathering graphical material from your sketchbooks and about to place that in a narrative that may have textual elements like dialogue or something, how do you organize the relationship between images and words on the page? Because, you know, a lot of your work, you really show that respect for space.
Sure. I mean, the text in my work is mostly just voices, like it's just people talking. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I try to leave room. I try to pay as much attention in a scene or in a scene to silent moments. It's like, I don't know, I was talking to somebody, I think I was talking to one of my students the other day about like, they had a kind of monologue scene with a person smoking a cigarette. And I kind of was like, the moment that they take a drag and the way they do it and where they're looking and like all that stuff is just as important as what they're saying. Like the word balloon, and needs just as much like space and energy in a book. I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but
I guess also, do you work from a script or something like that?
Oh, these days, yes, yes, I do basically. So like when I'm working on an issue of Big Question, or sorry, an issue of Tongues, I will basically script out the issue first and then thumbnail it, and the dialogue will always change. The dialogue in the scenes, like the action will always like shift and change a little bit between the scripting and the thumbnailing. And then I kind of pencil out the pages super roughly and it'll change again. So like I'm working on a scene right now where originally in the script, it was just a conversation between two characters, but they referenced something in the past. I guess I was going to show like a few frames of what happened in the past, but now those few frames have sort of turned into like, I realized like, okay, this is actually visually more important. Like there's another like parallel story to be told here. So like that gets, you know, I sort of rewrote it and like continued to edit it and develop it. I think early on early on as a cartoonist, I didn't script, and I think I thought that was better because I thought it was a visual, I thought comics was like really like primarily a visual medium, which I think is kind of true. But I think also it's like over time, I've just figured out that like the more, it's one of those weird like paradoxes, the more work you do, the less work you end up doing. So like if you do a script and then you thumbnail, it's just going to work a lot better than if you like try to go straight into drawing comics. And then if you decide to change something, well, you're kind of screwed because you already drew the page.
Thanks so much.
A question from Nick Mullins.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I just noticed, I mean, besides animals and talking animals, I've also noticed a lot of military imagery in your work, like the pilot and Big Questions and like the Hummers going by in Tongues. I'm just curious if you've got a personal connection to the military or this is just your way of working through your own concerns. I just was wondering if that's something, if there's any connection there for you.
Yeah, that's a super interesting question, actually. So Big Question, like the sort of source for Big Questions was an exercise that I did in the art class, like a sort of art retreat when I was an undergrad, where we were supposed to, the idea was you were going to draw 60 drawings in 60 minutes. So you had a stack of 60 pieces of paper. You're supposed to start with an object and draw that object. And the idea was like any habit, any like drawing habits you had, like after a while you get sick of them and like try something else or whatever. Like you would learn different ways to like draw. What ended up happening for me is like, so I started with a little soldier. I just sort of randomly brought like a little toy soldier along. And then after like 15 or 20 drawings, it turned into a comic. So like the soldier became a little character, and like these things happened, and these birds came down, and like a plane crashed. And so those are sort of like then I started doing little bird strips in my sketchbooks that like slowly turned into big questions. But there was this kind of like idea of the soldier was kind of like built into that story. And I think, you know, like I would say for myself as a as a boy growing up in the 80s, like war toys were a huge thing. And at the same time, I grew up in a household that was very sort of progressive, politically like super progressive. So there was always this kind of like, I really am into war toys and like you know, whatever, Vietnam movies. I also know like the world is super unjust and fucked up and whatever. So I think there is like, that has been a tension in my work just because of that. So like, and then when I started working on Dogs and Water was right when, you know, that was like 2003, the Iraq war had just started. So that, you know, originally it starts with this idea of a character kind of like out in the middle of nowhere, and it was about art and like the absurdity of being that in the world. But then it felt sort of inevitable to me that part of the absurdity of being an artist at a moment like this in history is like, you know, my government is doing X, Y, and Z in Iraq. And so that sort of bled into it. And then, yeah, I mean, that sort of is the world that Tongues now exists in. So it sort of makes sense that that would continue to be a thing. And then it's also like, the last thing I'll say about that too is like, you know, so many stories are, or what stories generally are sort of tend to be about extreme human experience. So like love and death and war and conflict and like manner, you know, like whether you or not you fit into the sort of social milieu and like betrayal and whatever. It's like that's like the themes, you know, of literature and of story. And so that's one, you know, that sort of military / violence narrative is definitely one that I kind of like gravitate towards.
Anybody else? So when you were at art school, was making comics an acceptable thing to do? Or is that, I don't know what years that was, or is that something you had to drop out of school to do? Or were they connected, dropping out?
Ultimately, well, so yeah, I was an undergrad from like 92 to 96. There was definitely I don't think there were really comics programs almost anywhere, like maybe at Savannah or SVA or something, but my professors had no idea what to make of it, kind of discouraged it, but I mean, I was doing it a bit, but then I also kind of was just doing other stuff. Like I was doing installation art and doing paintings and stuff. So I wasn't put off by the lack of support for comics. I did a kind of picture book. I did like an independent study and did this picture book. And that was like, I sort of convinced my professor that it was worthwhile. But I didn't really think that's the kind of artist I was going to be until I got out of school. And then I was out of school for a couple years, a year and a half, 2 years, and then went to grad school. And I applied to grad school with like all my weird installation art. But by the time I actually got there, I was doing comics. Like I had begun Big Questions. And so then it fairly quickly became apparent, like there is no reason for me to be here, because my professor, like they were supportive of comics, but they didn't have anything to offer really. And I also just didn't really like school. And so I ended up dropping out of grad school. But yeah, it's a different world now. Like there's comics programs everywhere. Like comics have pretty much taken over the school that I teach at now, which was, you know, not at all about that when I was a kid at MCAD.
Right. Okay, just curious. Okay, any other questions or comments? If not, so do you have a favorite illustrator of mythology, or somebody who made pictures, you know, from that world?
I mean, I loved I don't even know if I'm saying this right, but the Dolaires. I think it was a couple that did, they did like a Norse mythology book, and they did a Greek mythology book that's, you know, very well known. And I think it was the woman, what was her name? I don't know, I can't remember her name, but she's the illustrator, and she does these just like beautiful colored pen. I think they're colored pencil drawings. They're I think she was working probably in the 30s, 40s, 50s. It's D'*AULAIRES. My work is super different. Like her stuff is sort of, the color is just like phenomenally beautiful. Some of the drawing is like kind of clunky, but in a very beautiful way. So yeah, like the drawing was probably not super influential to me. And I don't, off the top of my head, I can't think of other like mythology illustrators that were important to me.
Mm-hmm.
I love, when I was a kid, I loved, what was it, Clash of the Titans? Was that Harryhausen?
Oh, the movie, yeah.
The movie, which looks super weird now, but at the time, like it was the height of cool, whatever, animation, live action and animation combined.
Okay. Lots of comments in the chat.
Oh, I'm not seeing the chat here.
I won't keep you. Thank you, that was great. Trying to, other conversation going on in the chat.
I can't, is there a way I can see the chat or not?
Oh yeah, if you just open it up at the bottom of your screen, there's a little link. It looks like a little speech balloon. It says chat. Should be able to open that up, no? Anyway.
Yeah, I'm not seeing it.
Anyway. Okay, thank you. That was
I see.
Great to look at. You can.
Oh, there doesn't look like, it looks like the questions in the chat mostly got asked, so.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah,
have a
thank
good
you,
day.
Ben, thanks for having me.
Have
you
a
too.
good day in Los Angeles.
All right,
And
thanks
see you
everybody.